All right, guys, here is the lecture for chapter 16 as promised. Um, it's a little over an hour long, which is about par for the course for me. But you can watch it at your own sort of leisure and several sessions if you like. So without further ado, we'll get started. The years after the Civil War are pretty much defined by very intense political controversy for the most part. The first thing that we have introduced is a plan for Reconstruction. Lincoln already thinking about Reconstruction even before the war is over, and he comes out with a plan in December of 1863. In that month, he issues a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, and this would enable Southern states to rejoin the Union if at least 10% of those who had cast ballots in the election of 1860 would take an oath of allegiance to the Union and accept emancipation. This minority could then create a loyal state government. Some Southerners were excluded. Confederate officials and military officers were all excluded. They would have to apply for a presidential pardon. And you also have black citizens excluded by this bill, or by this proclamation. It becomes known as Lincoln's 10% plan. The radical Republicans in Congress, however, didn't like the sort of quickness that this plan would have included. They were hoping for a much slower readmission process. They were hoping to exclude more ex-Confederate officials. And so in order to achieve that, they proposed what's known as the Wade-Davis Bill in July of 1864. This would provide for a military governor for each former Confederate state, and at least half the eligible voters would have to take an oath of allegiance. Delegates would then be elected to a state convention, which would repeal secession and abolish slavery. And in order to qualify as a voter, a Southerner would have to take an oath that they had never voluntarily supported the Confederacy. This plan, however, also didn't provide for suffrage for emancipated slaves. And this would have pretty much delayed readmission of these states almost indefinitely, most of them not going to take that oath that they had never supported the Confederacy. Lincoln didn't like this, what became known as the Wade-Davis Bill, and so he used his pocket veto to get rid of it. Basically, he refused to sign it before the session of Congress ended. We never really know what would have happened as far as Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction went, because Lincoln was assassinated before anything could take effect. After his assassination, the radical Republicans were hopeful that his successor, Andrew Johnson, would be a bit more cooperative. However, Johnson very quickly upset their ideas. He was from Tennessee. He was the only Southern senator to remain in Congress after his state seceded. He served as a military governor of Tennessee early in the war from 1862 to 1864. And his main problem was with the sort of planter aristocracy that existed in the southern states. He more focused on class issues than on racial issues, which is why he tends to butt heads with the Republicans in Congress. He was originally a slave owner. However, during the war, he reversed his position on slavery. He supported emancipation as a war effort, as a war goal, once it became one. But he never really adopted any abolitionist ideas, nor challenged the sort of basic racist sentiments that were still very popular in the country generally. He hoped mainly that the fall of slavery would enter those Southern aristocrats, which he disliked the most. Republicans in Congress very quickly found out that he had his own political agenda. He only became a Republican after the sort of secession crisis, and he was really only added to Lincoln's ticket in order to give Lincoln a bit broader appeal in the nation. So really, Johnson became president by accident. Nobody really expected it. In May of 1865, with Congress out of session, Johnson creates his own program to readmit all the southern states. Almost all of the Southerners who took an oath of allegiance would receive a pardon and amnesty from Johnson. Their property, except for their slaves, would be restored to them. Oath takers could then elect delegates to state conventions who would provide for regular elections. In those conventions, they would have to proclaim that secession was illegal and repudiate all of their state debts, which they incurred under the Confederacy, and ratify the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery. It had been proposed early in 1865 and would be ratified later that year. The same as under Lincoln's plan, Confederate civil and military officers would still be disqualified, but because of Johnson's animosity towards the aristocrats, anyone owning property over $20,000, worth over $20,000, would also be excluded under his plan. Johnson's presidential reconstruction took effect in the summer of 1865, and by the end of that year, all 7 states had created new civil governments that basically restored the status quo from before the war. The Confederate Army officers and large planters pretty much assumed most of the state offices. Some states refused to ratify the 13th Amendment or repudiate their Confederate debts as well. And all 7 of them took steps to ensure that landless, dependent black labor force stayed in place, even though they weren't slaves any longer. They didn't want to let them go, per se, and so they passed what became known as black codes. All states guaranteed some basic rights to former slaves. They had the right to marry, they could own property, they could make contracts, they could testify in courts against one another, not against white citizens, however. But the codes very harshly restricted their behavior. There was segregation in most public places. There was a prohibition on interracial marriage. They couldn't serve on juries. And they're pretty much barred very effectively from leaving the plantations where they had worked previously as slaves. Freedmen were no longer slaves, but they weren't really liberated either under these black codes. There were a lot of clauses in the codes that never took effect. However, the Union Army and federal agents suspended the enforcement of racially discriminatory provisions in the new laws, but they definitely revealed Southern white intentions, which was to restore, essentially, the system under slavery, but without actual slaves. And many Northerners denounced what they saw as Southern defiance. And so after that, we enter into Congressional Reconstruction as kind of retaliation for all of this. The status of Southern black citizens now becomes a major issue in Congress. There were some radical Republicans who hoped to impose black suffrage on the former Confederacy, as well as delay readmission of those Southern states. But most of those were still definitely a minority in Congress itself. There were some moderate Republicans, however, who agreed with the radicals that Johnson's plan was far too lenient, but they wanted to avoid a dispute with the president. No sort of bloc in Congress, none of these sort of interests, could claim a majority, and so they needed to overturn a presidential veto. So for the moment, Johnson's plan would have to stand. However, Johnson's sort of political ineptitude managed to alienate most of the moderate Republicans and sort of force them together to where they could make that majority and overrule his veto. There were 2 proposals that were put forth to try and invalidate the black codes, and they won very wide support among Republicans. The first of these was the continuation of the Freedmen's Bureau. It had been started in March of 1865, but only for a limited term, and so it was coming up for either to let it go or to renew. This organization provided relief, rations, medical care, built schools, and various other services for the freedmen. Congress voted to extend its life, but they also gave it new powers to run special military courts in order to settle labor disputes and to invalidate labor contracts that forced the freedmen to essentially abide by the Black Codes. Johnson attempted to veto the Freedmen's Bureau, but Congress was able to overrule his veto. They then passed a second measure, which would make freedmen U.S. citizens with the same civil rights as other citizens and authorize federal intervention in the states to ensure those rights in court. Johnson also attempted to veto that bill, but Congress again was able to override him, and it became the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It was the first major law ever passed over a presidential veto. The fact that Johnson did veto all these things was puzzling to a lot of Republicans. The new laws didn't really undercut his Reconstruction. They simply added to it. But Johnson felt that both bills were illegitimate because Southerners had been shut out of Congress and so had no say in the bills, and the bills were directly affecting them. He won wide support in the South because of this stance, but managed to alienate most of the Republicans who dominated Congress, and so sort of shot himself in the foot politically in that way. Johnson also underestimated the possibility of unity amongst the Republican factions, and once they united, they decided to take their next step, which was to ensure those same rights for these new black citizens in the form of a constitutional amendment. The 14th Amendment was adopted in Congress in April of 1866, and it declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens of the nation and of their states, and that no state could abridge their rights without due process of law or deny them equal protection of the law. This section was designed to essentially nullify the Dred Scott decision earlier. They also guaranteed that if a state denied suffrage to any of its male citizens, then representation in Congress would be proportionally reduced. It didn't guarantee suffrage of black citizens, but it did threaten repercussions should the South attempt to deny them the vote. And it's also the first time that the word male is specifically written into the Constitution, and it becomes an issue later on. It also disqualified from state national office any pre-war office holders, either civil or military, who had supported the Confederacy. They had to now get a pardon from Congress, and that was to limit the free pardons that Johnson had been giving out. Congressional elections in 1866 ended up being something of a referendum on the 14th Amendment. The passage of the amendment in Congress created something of a firestorm in the country. However, those congressional elections saw Republicans winning overwhelming landslide victories, and it was basically a mandate for the 14th Amendment because they now had enough of a solid majority in both houses of Congress that anything that the president attempted to veto could be overridden quite easily. I also have a picture on this slide, which I wanted to talk about specifically, as I think it's very clever. And this is talking about Johnson's attempt to veto the Freedmen's Bureau. You can see he's standing in a doorway labeled the veto. You have a sort of nice caricature of Johnson with his overlarge head, and he's kicking a bureau, as in the type of furniture. It's labeled, you can just see it's labeled Freedmen, and it's got all these little people jumping out of it. And so it's quite literally the Freedmen's Bureau, as in a chest of drawers, and he's kicking it out to show the veto. I just thought that was very clever. So now that we have established Republican majorities, we can move into congressional Reconstruction, which basically overturns Johnson's previous plan. This congressional Reconstruction was detailed under the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and then further acts which gave a bit more detailed instruction with regards to it. But the basic tenets were that all the state governments that had been formed under Johnson or Lincoln's previous Reconstruction plan were now invalidated. Only Tennessee was excluded from that because they had ratified the 14th Amendment, and so they were readmitted into the Union without any problems. The other states, the other 10 former Confederate states, were divided into 5 military districts, each district run by a Union general. Voters, which were all black citizens plus any white citizens who had not been disqualified by the 14th Amendment, could then elect delegates to a state convention, and that convention would write a new constitution. The constitution would have to guarantee suffrage for black citizens, and it would also have to support a Republican government. Eligible voters would then ratify the new constitution, and elections could be held for state officers after that. Once Congress approved the state constitution, and once the state legislature ratified the 14th Amendment, and the amendment became part of the federal constitution, then the state could be readmitted into the Union. The act was far more radical than Johnson or Lincoln's program, but it wasn't quite as radical as it could have been. While it did enfranchise black citizens and disenfranchise a lot of ex-Confederates, it did serve the one central goal of radical Republicans, which was prolonging the readmission process until Republican governments could be established in those states. Like I say, not as harsh as it could have been. It provided only for temporary military rule, and it didn't actively prosecute former Confederate leaders or provide for the confiscation or redistribution of property, which was a huge concern. There was a proposal to subdivide confiscated property into 40-acre tracts that could then be distributed amongst freedmen, but it never really got much support because most Republicans, like most Americans generally, had too high a value on property rights. The notion was that if they tampered too much with property rights in the South, then it might jeopardize those same rights in the North, and they might lose support in that way. So really, this so-called radical Reconstruction was more of a compromise than anything else. Johnson attempted to impede its enforcement. However, Republican majorities in Congress found it very easy to overrule him. Johnson is really starting to annoy the Republicans in Congress, and in March of 1867, they passed two laws designed to curb presidential power. The first of these was the Tenure of Office Act, which barred the president from removing civil officers without a Senate approval. And the main thing that they wanted to do was they wanted to protect the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was a radical ally. There was also a rider to an Army appropriations bill which barred the president from issuing military orders except through the commanding general, which was Grant. And as he was an office holder, he couldn't be removed without congressional consent. So they're really hoping to curb his ability to interfere with Reconstruction efforts. However, this wasn't quite far enough, and they actively began looking for a way to impeach the president. Initially, they couldn't find anything, but then Johnson missteps and makes it rather easy for them. In August of 1867, with Congress out of session, Johnson suspended the Secretary of War, Stanton, and replaced him with General Grant. When Congress reconvened, they refused to approve Stanton's suspension, and Grant quite happily vacated office. Johnson then attempted to remove Stanton again and replace him with another general. And this provided the House with some sort of tangible evidence that they could use for impeachment. And so they brought up charges based on this violation of the Tenure of Office Act. His trial in the Senate began in March of 1868, and under that, there were 11 articles of impeachment, which they were considering. Johnson's lawyers attempted to argue that he was simply seeking a court test of the Tenure of Office Act because he felt that the act itself was unconstitutional. He also less successfully argued that Secretary Stanton wasn't protected by the act anyways because he was appointed by Lincoln rather than Johnson. And that Johnson wasn't guilty of any crime that you might convict in a regular court, and so the impeachment itself was unnecessary. The congressional argument was that impeachment was a political process, not a criminal trial, and that Johnson's abuse of discretionary power constituted an impeachable offense. The Senate more or less split on party lines, but you do have some Republicans that sort of waver on the issue. They didn't want to, they were fearful that they might completely destroy the balance of power between Congress and the president, and that would severely upset the government years into the future. They were also very wary of the president pro tempore of the Senate, who would become president if Johnson were removed. Very little trust there, and so they didn't particularly want him in office. Ultimately, the vote was against Johnson, 35-19, but one vote short of the two-thirds majority that would be needed to convict him. And so Johnson survived the impeachment process. However, he was pretty much nullified as a political force at that point. However, we did manage to maintain the balance of power between the president and the Senate, and that's the really far-reaching consequence of this. The image we have here shows Johnson, again a caricature of Johnson with his nice sort of big head, which you see in caricature a lot, and you have him standing on a step stool reaching up for a volume labeled the Constitution of the United States, and then you have an unfortunate consequence of reaching for this rather large volume actually almost bigger than he is. And the idea behind this is that Johnson was sort of below the understanding of the Constitution, and if you tamper with things that are outside of your understanding, then bad things happen to you, as you can see in the other panel of the picture. So the sort of linchpin of congressional Reconstruction was the vote by black citizens, suffrage for black citizens, because it was only with that support that Republicans could expect to retain control of ex-Confederate states. They had forced the southern states to enfranchise black citizens in order to re-enter the Union, but much of the North still rejected the idea of black suffrage. And so the passage of the 15th Amendment had two aims. The first of these was to protect suffrage in the South from future repeal by Congress or the states themselves, but also to enfranchise those black citizens living in the northern and the border states who were left out of earlier efforts at extending the vote. Democrats argue that the proposal would violate states' rights by denying each state leverage over who would vote, but despite their objections, the amendment was ratified in 1870. There were, however, some pretty gaping omissions in the act itself. The act neither guaranteed black office holders or the ability of black citizens to hold office, nor did it prohibit voting restrictions based on other things like property requirements or literacy tests. And so those were the methods ultimately used to disenfranchise those voters later. The debate over suffrage also drew new participants into the political fray, namely the women's movement, because the act specifically left women out of the movement. Earlier, women's rights activists had attempted to join forces with abolitionist allies in groups like the American Equal Rights Association because they hoped that by promoting black suffrage, women's suffrage would go right along with it. Most radical Republicans, however, interested in extending the franchise to black citizens, not so much in extending it to women. And that provoked a lot of dispute among women's rights activists. Some argued that black suffrage would pave the way for women's vote later, and that black men deserved priority. One of these was Frederick Douglass, who was a supporter of women's rights earlier, however ended up breaking with a lot of female leaders. A lot of those female women's rights leaders, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, disagreed with him. In their view, the 14th Amendment had disabled women by including the word male specifically in the writing of it. And the 15th Amendment failed to remedy that injustice. And so they actually argued that it increased women's disadvantages. You essentially see a split in the women's rights movement, though. You have a much more moderate American Women's Suffrage Association, which retained its alliance with male abolitionists and campaigned for women's suffrage in the individual states. And then you have a far more radical organization led by those like Stanton and Anthony, which was the National Women's Suffrage Association, and they began pushing for an actual federal constitutional amendment. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I believe, even wrote a 16th Amendment, which would extend the vote to women. However, it was ultimately rejected. Throughout the 1870s, rival women's suffrage associations vied for constituents. In 1869 and 1870, independent of the suffrage movement, 2 territories, Wyoming and Utah, enfranchised women voters, but this failed to sway the opinions of legislatures elsewhere. One woman tried to vote in Missouri, a suffragist called Virginia Minor, and brought suit against the state for excluding her. However, when her case came up before the Supreme Court in Minor versus Happersett, the court declared that the state could constitutionally deny women the vote. This basically indicated that there was a long struggle up ahead for women's suffrage. The image I have here, talking about the passage of the 15th Amendment, it was aimed at enfranchising black citizens everywhere. But you do have considerable resistance from a lot of northern states who didn't want to. And in the picture, you have the sort of kindly-looking black voter attempting to cast his ballot, and he's being bugged by flies with titles or labels like New York, New Jersey, California, all states who objected to the idea of the 15th Amendment. With the institution of Reconstruction governments, you see a massive change in the electorate in the South. And you have 3 main groups that support the Republican sort of governments. Northerners who moved south after the Civil War were sort of in search for economic advancement, referred to as carpetbaggers. The implication was they had so few possessions that they could be stuffed into sort of small traveling bags made of carpet. These were oftentimes former Union soldiers who hoped to buy up land and open factories or build railroads, or simply just enjoy the warmer climate. Another group were called scalawags, and these are predominantly poor whites who lived in the South already, but sought to profit from Republican rule. Quite often they tended to be uneducated and generally left out of the previous Southern order. Some of them were sort of more middling, I suppose, class people, entrepreneurs who were hoping to utilize Republican policies such as national banking system, high protective tariffs, and other things in order to improve their economic position. Most of them were small farmers in the mountain regions, and also lacked any kind of commitment to equal rights or suffrage for black citizens. During Reconstruction, it was mainly these scalawags who held offices in the Republican governments in the South. As Reconstruction falls apart, though, many of them drifted back to the Democratic fold, so they weren't really passionate about their position. And the other major group that makes up the new electorate were the freedmen themselves. These are sort of the backbone of the Republican Party in the South. They provide about 8 out of 10 Republican votes. And the states that had the largest black populations tended to have much longer Republican governments in office. Freedmen were seeking mainly land, but education, civil rights, political equality, all of those things. And so they remained loyal to the Republicans because they felt they could provide that. They did hold offices. Black office holders on the state level tended to form the political elite of those groups, and they often differed from sort of everyday sort of common black voters, both in background, education, wealth, and also aims. A disproportionate number of black citizens in the South were illiterate, had been before the Civil War. Most of the political elite came from large cities or towns. Most of them had spent time in the North. Some of them were well-off property owners. Some of them had even been slave owners. And the vast majority of them were of mixed heritage. They were mulattoes rather than sort of one solid group or another. Black officials and black voters often had different priorities, like I said earlier. Most freedmen cared mainly for their economic future, acquiring land, keeping stable finances in order to support their families and themselves. Office holders tended to care more about more abstract ideas like attaining equal rights, and prize things like enfranchisement. Under the Republican governments, we also see a lot of democratic changes made to state constitutions. They abolished property qualifications for office holding. A lot of formally appointed offices were made elective. They redistrict state legislatures so they'd be more equal. And most of them, or all of them, established universal manhood suffrage. No state instituted land reform. A lot of them were hoping to attract northern investment to the reconstructed South. And so Southern Republicans hesitated to threaten property rights or adopt land reform measures that Northern Republicans had already rejected. Once civil power shifted, though, from the federal army to the new state governments, regimes began ambitious programs of public works. They built roads, they built public buildings, they approved rail bonds, funded schools, various other things. They also expanded the state bureaucracies, raised the pay for state employees, formed militias, and created a public school system. All of these changes, though, were very expensive, and so taxes in the South skyrocketed. State legislatures increased poll taxes or head taxes, which were basically levies on individuals. They enacted luxury and sale taxes, and also imposed property taxes, which before the war, the only property that was taxed were slaves. Now that slaves were gone, we're actually taxing sort of land and things like that, which was an entirely new experience, and also affected smaller landowners as opposed to just the big ones. And so you have a lot of opposition to these new governments. It also doesn't help that a lot of these governments tended toward corruption. It wasn't all of them. States like Mississippi had very honest Republican governments, but then you could point to states like Louisiana, where the governor would pocket thousands of dollars in state funds, and corruption pretty much permeated everything the government did. Not all of the corrupt officials were Republican, nor did the Republican regimes hold a monopoly on corruption. Bribery basically pervaded all government transactions, both in the North and in the South. And actually far more money changed hands in the North than it did in the South. But critics assailed Republican rule for other reasons in the South. A lot of ex-Confederates spoke with dread about the idea of black enfranchisement and the horror of Negro domination. Democrats tried to delay mobilization until the southern states were readmitted to the Union, and then they swung into action to try and counter this movement for black enfranchisement. At first, they sought to try and win black voters over, but that ultimately failed, and then they moved on to other tactics. Democrats still attempted to undercut Republican power. In pretty much every southern state, they contested elections, they backed dissident factions, they elected some Democratic legislatures, and attempted to lure away sort of wavering voters. You also have vigilante efforts, which are aimed at intimidating black voters away from the polls for the most part. These groups started to spring up kind of spontaneously in all parts of the former Confederacy under names like moderators or regulators, or in Louisiana you have the Knights of the White Camellia. However, the one that became most dominant started out as a social club in 1866, and it was the Ku Klux Klan. However, by 1868, the Klan was no longer really a social club, and they now became something of a terrorist movement, attempting to forcibly keep black voters away from the polls. They adapted tactics sort of aimed at various local conditions. They would target schools, they would target office holders, Republican office holders. It kind of depended on where you were, where they were operating, as to what tactic they would use the most. Some Democrats denounced the Klan as cutthroats and riffraff, but Klansmen also included prominent ex-Confederates and prominent sort of Democrats. This kind of vigilantism united Southern whites of different social classes and also drew on the sort of energy of Confederate veterans. Republican legislatures passed laws to try and outlaw this kind of action, but as the state militia could not enforce them, they turned to the federal government for help, and the federal government answered by passing the Enforcement Acts. The first of these was designed to protect black voters. Often fell short, though, because witnesses to violations were too afraid to come forward and testify. And juries, when they did come forward, failed to convict, usually. The second act provided for federal supervision of Southern elections. And the third act, known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, strengthened punishments for any who tried to prevent black voters from voting. By 1872, the federal government had effectively managed to suppress the Klan, but vigilantism had served its purpose. Most black voters now are staying away from the polls out of fear for the most part. Here I have some images to share with you. The image on the bottom right is an image of a carpetbagger, a sort of derogatory image of the carpetbagger. So you can see him with his bag and he's headed for the south. But his figure, the way that he's presented, I think gives a very clear indication of how people felt about him. He's sort of got what Shakespeare described as the lean and hungry look about him, which makes him sort of sinister looking. Just above that, you have image of Klans members. This one from, well, it doesn't actually say what section they're from, but you can sort of recognize their notable hoods and disguises. And then on the left, you have a picture of members of the South Carolina legislature. The photograph is entitled Radical Legislatures, and you can see both black and white men represented here. But it also suggests to the extent of black representation. South Carolina, one of those states that had a rather large population of black citizens, and they actually had a majority. Black representatives did in the legislature of South Carolina, at least under Republican Reconstruction. So we'll move on now to talk about the effects of emancipation on the slave, or in this case, the former slave population. For many of them, liberty meant mobility, the ability to move off of plantations where they were before essentially held captive. Landowners found that one freed slave after another was vanishing, with house servants and artisans sort of leading the way. Field workers had less contact with whites generally, and so they were more likely to stay behind. But a lot of them left nonetheless. Emancipation also stirred up waves of migration within the former Confederacy. Some of them left the Upper South for the Deep South, where planters needed more labor, and so paid higher wages, and they could find work there. More left the countryside for towns and cities. But most of them eventually went back to their sort of old locations. They tended to settle on neighboring plantations to the ones that they had worked on as slaves. Very few of them actually returned to their old plantations to work under their old masters. A lot of the migration was fueled by the desire to find lost family members. The Freedmen's Bureau helped where they could to try and find information about missing relatives and to try and resolve conflicts when, say, for instance, spouses were broken up through sale and one spouse found another spouse as a replacement, and so conflicts like that arose, and the Bureau attempted to deal with those. Reunification efforts, for the most part, failed. A lot of them found it very difficult to find those lost loved ones, but you do still have some success story. Once reunited, they moved very quickly to try and legalize those unions, oftentimes in mass ceremonies with up to 70 couples being legally married. Marriage affected family life a great deal. Men asserted themselves as household heads. Wives of able-bodied men often withdrew from the labor force altogether in order to care for house and home and family. Women's desire for domestic life also caused a lot of labor shortages. So by Reconstruction's end, a lot of black women had unfortunately returned to agricultural work as part of sharecropping families because they needed the work in order to make ends meet. Others would take paid work in cities. However, the idea or the ideal was still that they would be able to go home and take care of their children and their families rather than have to work. And quite a few of them still managed to do that. The desire for independence also fostered the growth of a number of institutions, churches especially, in the late 1860s. Some freedmen congregations met at churches operated by northern missionaries, and others withdrew from white-run churches and formed their own in their own areas. Black churches offered a very sort of fervent, participatory experience. They also provided relief, raised funds for schools, supported Republican policies, and ministers became the leading sort of political figures in a lot of communities. Black schools also played a crucial role for freedmen. Ex-slaves were very eager to seek literacy, especially for themselves, but especially for their children as well. At emancipation, blacks organized their own schools, and the Freedmen's Bureau quickly stepped in to try and supervise them and formulate them into proper systems. Within 3 years, each southern state had a public school system, at least in principle, generally with separate schools for black students and white students. Advanced schools also began opening to train tradesmen and teachers and ministers in the black communities as well. Education, however, remained fairly limited. Very few rural black families could reach the schools, which often were in towns and villages. The schools themselves were underfunded and so could only hold classes for a very short time, and sometimes even drew attacks from various vigilante groups. School segregation and other forms of racial segregation were also taken for granted for the most part. Even after the invalidation of the black codes, the custom of segregation continued on various public services. Senator Charles Sumner began promoting a bill that would desegregate schools and transportation facilities and various things like that. And after his death, Congress honored him by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which included his proposal for integration except in the school system. In 1883, however, the civil rights cases basically invalidated the law. The 14th Amendment, they argued, did not prohibit discrimination by individuals, only that perpetuated by the states. So privately run endeavors like streetcars or restaurants or movie houses or things like that were perfectly capable of insisting on segregation. White Southerners rejected the prospect of racial integration. They felt that that would lead to racial mixing, which was seen as the ultimate sin. Urban blacks sometimes challenged segregation practices, but most freed blacks were very much less interested in social equality in the sense of sort of interracial mingling. The new post-war elite in the black community, people like teachers and ministers and politicians, served exclusively black constituencies, and so therefore had an interest in keeping the races separate. But generally speaking, the community had very little interest in mixing with their former masters and oppressors. They were ultimately seeking freedom from white control. Above all, they wanted to acquire land, which was the ultimate symbol of personal independence for many of them. Freedmen's visions of land ownership, however, largely failed to materialize. As we've seen, neither Congress nor the southern states imposed any kind of large-scale land reform. In 1866, Congress passed the Southern Homestead Act, which set aside about 44 million acres of public land in various southern states for freedmen and loyal whites to obtain. However, this acreage was generally consisting of poor soil, and very few had the resources to survive on it until their first harvest. Excuse me. Most were unable to establish farms, and without large-scale land reform, obstacles to ownership for newly freed slaves and even poor whites remained overwhelming. The obstacles were. I'm really sorry. I've got like a frog in my throat. So first, most freedmen lacked the capital to buy land and equipment needed to work it effectively. White Southerners generally opposed selling land to blacks as well, and planters also had a really invested interest in maintaining an unlanded workforce so they could continue working on their large pieces of land. Cash was generally scarce in the South, and so wages for workers on plantations usually took the form of a share of the crop, which was usually about an eighth or less, and it was divided amongst all the workers, so they got a very small portion of it. Freedmen didn't like the new wage system, and especially because it used gang labor, and so it quite often resembled slavery in that sense, and so they didn't really appreciate it. Planters also had complaints about the system. The labor force had shrunk to about half its pre-war size because women were refusing to work in the fields like they had done previously. And you also have planters who are now competing for workers. If one planter doesn't pay enough or doesn't offer as much as his neighbor does, then the worker has an incentive to move over. And so that kind of competition wasn't particularly welcomed by the planters themselves. The freedmen were often scorned as being lazy or inefficient because they also weren't producing as much as they were under slavery. The main reason for this, though, was that they refused to work like slaves. They had shorter hours. The women weren't working in the fields. As productivity falls, though, land values also fall, plummeting prices on the world market, poor harvests, all of this is making life very difficult. And so then they start to experiment with new labor schemes. And the one they eventually hit on was sharecropping, which very simply was plantation owners would divide their land into smaller plots. Each plot would go to a sharecropper family, and that family would farm that particular plot. The landowner would provide tools, they would provide the seed, and then together they would harvest it, and they would essentially split the harvest. The landowner would get roughly half, and the sharecropper would get roughly half. There was a problem with this system, however, and it became known as the crop lien system. A lot of what they worked with was based on loans. The sharecropper didn't often have the capital to front initially, and so they would make a lien. Ultimately, whenever they brought their crop in, though, it wouldn't be enough to cover the lien, and so it trapped them in this massive cycle of debt, as you can see on the diagram here in this slide. So Republicans had very good reasons to bypass their party leaders and nominate a popular candidate for president in Ulysses S. Grant. Part of the reason was that he was widely endorsed by Union veterans and just generally popular. In the North, the Democrats chose to run New York Governor Horatio Seymour against him. Seymour had been widely critical of Lincoln during the war and also very critical of congressional reconstruction. Grant ran mostly on personal popularity rather than the issues. He managed to carry all but 8 states in the Electoral College. However, his popular vote margin was very slim. And the advantage for Grant actually came from southern states and the newly enfranchised freedmen who overwhelmingly voted in his favor. While he was a good general on the field, he proved to be a fairly passive president and lacked political skill. Generally speaking, his cabinet appointees were mediocre, if not downright unscrupulous, and scandal tended to sort of sit like a permanent fog over his administration. Although he wasn't personally involved in any of the scandals, he had a tendency to defend his subordinates, partly as a matter of personal pride. And so for critics, Grantism came to be synonymous with fraud, bribery, political corruption. And this extended beyond Washington. For example, in Pennsylvania, companies like Standard Oil and the Pennsylvania Railroad had large control over legislatures there. You also see the advent of political machines, which pretty much dominate urban politics for the rest of the century and become a key target for progressive reformers in the early 20th century. Grant did have some success, however, in the realm of foreign policy. In 1872, his administration managed to engineer the settlement of the Alabama claims with Britain. This involved damage done by Confederate-owned but British-built ships, and an international tribunal actually awarded the United States upwards of $15 million as compensation. Grant's administration also ran into some difficulty, however, when it came to acquiring new territory. William Seward had managed to negotiate a treaty for the purchase of Alaska, although that was somewhat ridiculed because Alaska wasn't seen as a particularly valuable piece of land. It was referred to as Seward's icebox. Grant decided that he would like to annex the eastern portion of Santo Domingo, which is now the Dominican Republic. And that, however, didn't win a lot of backing either. Grant saw it as a possibility of promoting Caribbean trade, as well as provide a safe haven for prosecuted Southern blacks who are now sort of facing trials from former Confederates who were unhappy with their situation, as we discussed earlier. But Congress didn't particularly care for the plan, and they rejected his annexation treaty, which didn't help Grant's reputation at all. As the 1872 election approaches, you have some dissident Republicans, and they kind of break off and form their own party known as the Liberal Republicans. This revolt served to split the Republican Party and undermined a lot of support for Republican policies in the South. Liberals urged things like civil service reform in order to bring the best men into government, sort of an actual reaction against Grantism. They rejected the regular Republican sort of high tariff policy. They espoused free trade. And more important, they decried bayonet rule in the South, wanting to get the Union Army out of the South and get rid of military rule. Even some one-time radicals claimed that Reconstruction had achieved its goal, and it needed to come to an end at this point. Corruption in government, both in the North and in the South, also posed a greater danger, or was seen as posing a greater danger than any kind of Confederate resurgence. And so politicians in the North are starting to lose some of that push for Reconstruction and for equal rights and concern for the newly freed slaves. For president, the new party nominated Horace Greeley. The Democrats also endorsed Greeley in the election as well. Grant, however, managed to win just 56% of the popular vote and managed to carry all the northern states, as well as most of the southern and border states. But the division amongst Republicans greatly affected Reconstruction. In order to kind of take an issue away from the liberal faction, Grant had Republicans in Congress pass an Amnesty Act, which would allow most ex-Confederate officials to hold office. And in his second term, the desire to discard the Southern question altogether is growing because now the nation is entering into a depression. Post-war years brought accelerated industrialization, very rapid economic growth, and frantic speculation, and the railroads led that sort of speculative boom. However, this tended to lead entrepreneurs to over-speculate, and the results were quite devastating. One banker, Jay Cook, had taken over a new transcontinental line, the Northern Pacific, in 1869, and initially the securities sold very well. But in 1873, the line's construction costs managed to outrun the bond sales, and in September, Cook defaulted on his obligations, and his bank, which was the largest bank in the nation, was forced to shut down, and this was the sort of kicking off of a massive financial depression. The depression lasted for about 5 years following the Panic of 1873, and within 2 years, 18,000 businesses went bankrupt and 3 million people were unemployed. The Depression reveals that conflicts within the United States are now moving away from sectional issues, which had pretty much dominated American politics, almost from the very beginning, and is now looking at the rapid societal changes that are coming from industrialization as the main issue that we will be confronting. The Depression also fed dispute over currency, and the currency fight was mainly over sound money, where they wanted to remove paper money, greenbacks, from circulation, or easy money, where they wanted to keep those in circulation in order to expand credit and make loans easier to obtain. The issue was divisive for both of the major parties, and a lot of it revolved around how to repay the federal debt. And eventually, the issue boils down into a fight over silver, largely in the 1890s. The Supreme Court also kind of starts to work to chip away at Reconstruction. Republicans began moving away from Reconstruction in that way as well. The first question that pops up is, would the court support laws that protect the rights of freedmen? And the decision handed down in Ex parte Milligan suggests that they will not. This decision basically said that the use of military tribunals when not in a state of war and when you have functioning civilian courts was unlawful. And so the military tribunals that were supporting the Freedmen's Bureau decisions were essentially declared unconstitutional. The second question is, would the court sabotage congressional reconstruction? And the answer is actually no, and you'll forgive me because I accidentally wrote yes on the slide here. But in Texas versus White, the Supreme Court ruled that although the Union was indissoluble and secession was legally impossible, the process of Reconstruction was still considered constitutional. However, you start to see a shift in the attitude towards Reconstruction after 1870, where the courts begin to back away from the policy. The first instance we see of this is in the Slaughterhouse cases in 1873, and the Supreme Court kind of chips away at the ability of the 14th Amendment, or the ability of the 14th Amendment to protect individuals. This doesn't involve freedmen's rights. It involves a business question, which kind of, again, shows the way the wind is blowing towards industrialization being the major issue rather than sectional issues. And it involved the state of Louisiana. Louisiana had granted a monopoly in New Orleans to one slaughterhouse business and basically closed down all of its competitors. And those competitors brought suit against the state of Louisiana, claiming that they were being deprived of their lawful occupation without due process of law, which is supposed to be protected by the 14th Amendment. The court, however, declared that the Louisiana legislature was completely within its rights, and they issued a doctrine to support this called dual citizenship. The 14th Amendment, they argued, protected only the rights of national citizenship, such as the right to interstate travel, but not those rights that fell to citizens through state citizenship. So this is essentially taking away the intent of the 14th Amendment to protect individual rights against state encroachment. And it has an impact for freedmen as well. The Supreme Court again backs away from Reconstruction in two further cases, in 1876, involving the Enforcement Act, which had been enacted to protect black suffrage. These two cases were United States versus Reese and United States versus Cruikshank. And it's in these that the Supreme Court undermines the effectiveness of the Enforcement Act. Continuing that retreat from Reconstruction, in 1883, they invalidate both the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, both of them cumulatively dismantling Reconstruction policies that had been sponsored before the war and immediately after the war. Immediately after the war, and confirmed that Northern sentiment was starting to rise up against Reconstruction's, at least egalitarian goals. The Republican Party also officially begins to retreat from Reconstruction. It begins with Grant's election to the presidency. Grant defended Reconstruction, but he believed in decentralized government and so hesitated to assert federal authority in local and state affairs. In the 1870s, as the Northern military force was shrinking in the South, Republican idealism also was waning in the North. The liberal Republican revolt eroded any sort of remnants of radicalism in the Republican Party, and commercial and industrial interests now became the sort of dominant interest groups in the party itself. Very few Republicans had any interest in rekindling sectional strife by continuing to push Reconstruction. And so support for Reconstruction became something of a political liability. By 1875, radical Republicans that had been prominent in the 1860s also vanished. Most of them had died by this point, and other radicals were losing their conviction. Things like waving the bloody shirt, essentially pointing out that the Democrats had started the Civil War, now appeared to be counterproductive. And it also seemed fairly pointless to continue the unpopular, expansive policy of military intervention in the South in order to prop up Republican regimes that even President Grant, who, if you recall, Grantism, named after him, is the symbol of corruption, but even he thought the Southern Republican governments were corrupt. And so it also seemed fairly suicidal to try and prop those governments up. Finally, very few Republicans shared the kind of egalitarian spirit that had animated earlier radical Republicans like Charles Sumner. All politics aside, Republican leaders and voters generally agreed with Southern Democrats that Black Americans, although worthy of freedom, were still inferior to whites and so not worthy of equality. So the Republican collapse in the South begins to accelerate after 1872. Congressional amnesty enabled a lot of ex-Confederate officials to regain office. Divisions among Republicans weakened their grip on the electorate in the South, and attrition diminished the Republican ranks as well. A lot of carpetbaggers were returning to the North. A lot of scalawags were sort of repatriating with the Democrats. And they were unable to win any new white votes, largely, and they weren't really able to retain the old ones. And so the very fragile Republican coalition in the South begins to crumble rather quickly. The resurrected Democratic Party in the South was divided, however. Businessmen who envisioned an industrialized South opposed the agrarian faction known as the Bourbons, the sort of old planter elite. But Democrats shared one goal, and that was to get the Republicans out. Their tactics varied by state. Alabama Democrats won by promising to cut taxes and getting the white vote out. In Louisiana, you have groups like the White League, which was a vigilante group seeking to undermine Republican votes. Intimidation proved a very effective strategy in several states. But it didn't completely squelch black voting. However, Democrats managed to deprive Republicans of enough votes from freedmen in order to start winning state elections. And so together, intimidation and economic pressure succeeded in sort of ousting Republican sentiment in the South. The word Democrats used to describe the return to power was redemption, and it brought massive changes to those states. Some states called for constitutional conventions in order to reverse the Republican policies. All of them cut back their expenses. They wiped out social programs, lowered taxes, revised their tax systems to relieve landowners of their tax burdens. State courts limited the rights of tenants and sharecroppers, and most importantly, they used their law to ensure that you had a stable black labor force as well. For the freedmen, whose aspirations had begun rising under Republican rule, redemption was particularly devastating. In the late 1870s, as political climate grew more oppressive, you see an exodus movement where many of them are attempting to leave. And you see a lot of African Americans becoming homesteaders in Kansas, attempting to run away from this new, harsher Democrat system. However, most of them lacked the resources to move, and so their escape routes were cut off. It's in this sort of climate that we come into the election of 1876, where we essentially have a kind of sectional election, because the parties are essentially sectional parties yet again. By the autumn of 1876, both parties are seeking to discard the heritage that Reconstruction and the war left behind. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes for their presidential candidate. He presented himself as a moderate on Southern policy. He favored home rule in the South and a guarantee of civil and political rights for all, which is somewhat contradictory. The Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden of New York, who was a millionaire corporate lawyer and a political reformer. Both candidates favored sound money and endorsed civil service reform and decried corruption, so very reactionary with regards to Grant previously. Tilden managed to win the popular vote by 3% margin, and while it seemed obvious that he would capture the electoral vote as well, Republicans challenged some of the pro-Tilden returns they got in states like South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, where you still have some hangers-on Republican governments in place. The Democrats needed only one of the disputed electoral votes for victory, and so they challenged the validity of one of Oregon's electoral votes. So there are problems brewing. The Republicans still sort of have control of political machinery, so they declare Hayes the winner, but you have a dilemma coming up. Each party claimed victory in all the contested states, and each accused the other of fraud. In fact, both of them had practiced fairly fraudulent things. In January of 1877, Congress created a special electoral commission. This had 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. The independent was expected to go Democrat, and so they expected Tilden to be not elected. However, that independent won a Senate seat himself, and so he resigned from the commission in order to take up his Senate seat, and he was replaced by a Republican, and so the commission voted in favor of Hayes, and Hayes was made the president. However, Republican leaders, while they wanted to win the election, they also wanted to win at least some measure of Southern approval. And so in informal negotiations, it was agreed that if Hayes won the election, he would remove federal troops from South Carolina and Louisiana, the places where they remained, and Democrats could gain control of those states. Southern politicians also asked for federal patronage, federal aid to railroads, federal support for internal improvements, and in return, they promised to drop the filibuster and accept Hayes as president, and at least deal with him fairly. All of these things were accepted. They dropped the filibuster. The Senate ratified Hayes' election, and once in office, he fulfilled at least some of the promises that he had made. This was known as the Compromise of 1877, and it pretty much left freedmen and their rights out in the cold. They were pretty much neglected in the interests of sectional harmony after that. So that's the sort of sad state that they have moving into the industrial age. Last but not least, I have a picture here, and I think it's a fairly clever picture. It's called the Democrats, DEMOC with a hyphen and then rats, caught in the presidential trap. The Electoral Commission was actually a recommendation by the Democrats because they felt sure that the independent would vote in their favor. However, when he was replaced by a Republican, they were obviously going to lose. And so here you have the Democrats, all the rats have the heads of the Democrats in the commission, and they are stuck in a trap of their own making. And part of the trap, you have the heads of the Republicans on the commission sort of making up parts of the trap. Very clever, I thought, and an interesting way of looking at the Compromise of 1877.